Epstein Island was an Israeli Mossad op to blackmail U.S. politicians. AIPAC makes our government put Israel's interests before ours. COVID was a scam and we got poisoned while Israeli big pharma made billions and our Israeli-controlled government and media forced it. The U.S. is an occupied nation. Those words of wisdom come from theorist, shall we say, Dan Bilzerian. Uh, Welcome to the reality show. Today we're discussing conspiracy theories, as they are called. I'm joined by Michael Kaufman, and I'm joined by Ben Baer of the Ayn Rand Institute. Hey guys. Um,
So we're not discussing reality then, Razi?
well, we're discussing. First of all, we're discussing this kind of thinking and what to make of it. Let's say what to make of it, what to make of the idea that these are theories, and what to make of their growing presence in our public discourse.
Well, I think the first thing to say about this example and many others, we've been inundated with conspiracism over the last week, especially since the Trump assassination attempt. First thing to say about it is that it's not thinking. You said, what should we think about this kind of thinking? It's not thinking. It has the verbal form of thinking. Its purveyors try really hard to make you think that they're thinking and to convince themselves that they're engaging in a cognitive process. But I think the secret to understanding what's going on is that it's not just that it's bad thinking, it's that it's not thinking at all. It's wishful thinking, so-called. It's driven by the imagination, driven by desires that the purveyors of it have, what they would like to be true, what they would like to believe to be true, using their imagination to gin up a story. And that's not thinking, that's imagination. It's fantasy. My colleague at ARI, Ankar Gate, puts it as, these are not conspiracy theories, they're conspiracy fantasies.
Yeah, and I thought that tweet was a good way to start the show because it packs in so many of them, but ultimately it's all
Yeah.
about the Jews, as you can see. Michael, I think you are found guilty on several counts in that tweet, but again, I don't know if even saying that gives it some sort of legitimacy, but yeah, your thoughts and yeah.
Well, I agree with Ben. At best, it's selective grabbing one or two facts and running with them as far as they go, independent of any other facts or anything that contradicts that. It reminds me in science and medicine that, people can have lots of theories, but the first thing we do as scientists and doctors is we check other surrounding facts and see if that makes sense. You might remind the people that think the Jews run everything that the level of anti-Semitism is higher than it's ever been, and the reality of the situation is that if the Jews did run everything, I'm about 100% sure that they wouldn't have this level of anti-Semitism and ridiculousness and hate around. So even at first fact, it doesn't hold any water.
And
So
one reason that I think it's apt to say they're not conspiracy theories, they're conspiracy fantasies, is because even calling them theories is giving them too much credibility. It's actually giving them a lot of credibility. If you think what a theory is in science, it's an achievement. It's something like Newton's theory of universal gravitation, Darwin's theory of evolution. It's something that is the outcome of decades of systematic gathering of evidence and integration. And of course, there's a colloquial usage of the term theory that's a little more neutral than that. Sometimes it's even used pejoratively, like that's just a theory. Now that's what the creationists usually say about evolution, as though there's something wrong with being a theory. No, actually there's something great about being a theory, as opposed to a hypothesis, as opposed to a mere conjecture, as opposed to mere speculation on the basis of arbitrary imagination, which is what's actually going on in so-called conspiracy theories.
So you've spoken about this and written about this in the past, and you mentioned in somewhere, I think it was in a video you and Onkar Gate did a few years ago, that after Watergate there was a rise, which was an actual conspiracy. There was a rise in conspiracy so-called theories or conspiracy fantasies. Um, there's also a rise today. What do you make of that? What is the reason for that?
Well, one thing to note, I can't remember what I said before about Watergate. I wouldn't be surprised if there was an uptick in them afterwards, in part because, well, Watergate was an actual conspiracy and an actual secret plot by Nixon to, bug and steal dirt from the Democratic National Committee. And so that, in some people's minds, may have raised the plausibility that more of them are happening. Now, the fact that one happens doesn't mean that others are happening. It might increase your confidence that Nixon's capable of them. I don't know. But the important historical thing to note is that while, yes, there are many of them in our presence today, the scholars I've read on the subject suggest it's not a unique historical maximum that we're at. That at least in the history of the United States, there's been a rise and fall of them, a cyclical, a cycle of rise and falls over the course of the history of the U.S. I mean, going back to the founding of the nation. So it's not something that's a unique problem today, but like it is a problem. And locally speaking, it's a problem. Like it's gotten worse than it was 15, 20 years ago, I think. Worse than it was even after after 2001, when there were all these 9/11 truth conspiracy claims. Why does it happen? That's, I think, a more complex question. But I would cite, I suppose, 2 or 3 major factors. One is just the tribalistic nature of our politics. I think that conspiracism is a natural ally of tribalism, because if you are not motivated by any positive values, especially if you're not motivated by the positive value of the truth, and instead you're motivated by opposing the bad guys that you judge to be on the other side, the other tribe, well, it's very convenient to be able to blame the bad guys for various nefarious plots, and that's of course what conspiracism is made to order to do. So that's one reason. I think it's an outgrowth of tribalism, or it's fueled by tribalism. Another reason is that there's the major article I've written on this subject was about Ayn Rand's view of conspiracism. I've done some other articles analyzing local cases, but her view was that people resort to conspiracy claims when they don't understand what's going on with the world. And in part, it's because they don't understand the role of philosophy. They don't understand that the major events of the world, including many of the major catastrophes, are the outcome of either the philosophic ideas that everybody actually accepts, or the failure to articulate a rational philosophy. And so for her, it's not secret plots that are driving the world, though there are sometimes secret plots. The fundamental thing that moves the world is ideas that everybody openly accepts, but nobody fully understands the implications of the ideas that they accept. And so they can't believe sometimes when people actually act on them. And there's all kinds of examples of this we could talk about, like 9/11 is a good one. How is it that the mightiest nation on earth, the United States, could be attacked horribly and tragically and disgracefully by some 2-bit terrorists wielding box cutters? People just don't understand how that's possible. It doesn't sound like it should happen. But what they don't understand is the way in which the United States has defaulted on its moral authority. They don't understand how it is in 1,000 different ways appeased Saudi Arabia, Iran, various Islamic theocratic powers and thereby emboldened terrorism. And that's fundamentally what makes it possible. And for many other alleged conspiracies, you can point to something else that is out there in the open that explains why these terrible things happen. You don't have to resort to some kind of secret plot, though in this case there was a secret plot, but it was a secret plot by Al-Qaeda, and there's plenty of evidence for that. So that the second factor is, people don't understand what's happening in the world. They don't understand the role of philosophy. And then the third thing I would say is just that there's a overall coarsening of our discourse where intellectuals of our day simply, and this is part of what I meant by default before, intellectuals of our day simply don't give us proper epistemological guidance for how to think about these things. It's a kind of freshman philosophy class 101 idea that anything that you can imagine is possibly true as long as it's not ruled out by some evidence. And so maybe it's true, maybe I'm wrong. This is, the kind of argument that Descartes uses for his, evil demon kind of skepticism. It's used in dozens of different ways by modern philosophers, thinking about brains in vats. And you see it starting to trickle down into the popular culture these days, especially like the AI doomers, I think, make use of it constantly, that same kind of thinking, the various ways that the robots might take over and we won't know that it's happening because they'll have fooled us. I mean, it's basically just taking a page from Descartes and the default of modern epistemology. And so those are the big three factors I would cite.
Thank you, Roland, for the super chat. Roland says, "Hey, Ben, good to see you." Michael, so Ben was talking about how, one of the issues is people don't understand the world. And I think your field, first of all, is difficult for those of us who are not in it to understand, particularly difficult. And also, therefore, something that people like to come up with conspiracy fantasies about. So your thoughts on that, and also how
look,
it relates to general.
I think Ben makes great points. I would extend it a little bit, and I'll get into the pharmaceuticals question and new medicines and so on in a minute. But I think the other thing that's going on is that people are increasingly losing confidence in the so-called great institutions that we used to have. All the way from Harvard, which lost all credibility. It has certainly done it over the years, but it became extremely public with the recent congressional hearings, and the same for MIT and Cornell and so on, and Columbia and so forth. And frankly, most of the humanities, at least the humanities groups in most liberal arts colleges, if not essentially all liberal arts colleges in America and beyond, have lost a lot of credibility. Most recently, we saw another example of the DEI movement, which came from the negativist philosophy, as Ben said, that grew at and leads to this sort of tribalism over meritocracy. We saw that at the Secret Service, and thankfully, the director of the Secret Service of the U.S., which everyone used to have confidence in, has resigned as of a few hours ago because and she was a staunch supporter of DEI and having people that really don't know what they're doing, protecting important figures, which led to the disaster. And as you said earlier about 9/11, same kind of thing. How could this possibly happen? How could somebody with an AR-15 get within miles of the president, never mind within hundreds of yards of the former president and presidential candidate? And I think we've lost faith in the United Nations. We've lost faith in the international so-called Court of Justice, which is clearly not UNRWA and so on. And finally, we lost a lot of faith in the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control and Tony Fauci and the whole group at the NIH, who supported all kinds of ridiculous policies. And the people who went against those policies, turns out their outcomes in their states were just as good or even better than those who penalized everyone for living, which was to say lock them up and make sure they don't breathe on anyone. So I think much of this comes from a loss in confidence in the people who are supposed to be telling us facts. And even when it becomes clear, for example, just to pick the recent one, it's clear that the lab leak theory is highly likely to be the real result, everyone believes this is going to be swept under the rug, much as what really happened to the Kennedy assassination was. And we're not going to discuss it because the powers that be don't want to discuss the fact that the federal government, with Tony Fauci and so on, covering up a very plausible theory and also threatening people who espouse that theory, or at least put it out there as a hypothesis that deserves a lot of scientific attention. And frankly, a lot more than the notion this grew out of an animal interaction with a human in a market, in a wet market, where essentially what they're saying is anything is possible in a wet market. It's in China, this kind of stuff just sort of willy-nilly happens. My industry is plagued with a combination of bad behavior by some players, and the most recent one, of course, is the opioid crisis, where one or two bad players, Purdue Pharma and others, were engaged in ethical violations. You can call it murder. Certainly, there were a lot of goals to get people on higher and higher doses of opioids and stuck on them. That said, our industry is also responsible for saving more lives in the world than any other industry in the world. We manufacture vaccines, which, despite some of the conspiracy theorists, have actually saved a ton of lives, including the COVID vaccine, which if you were a young person with no medical problems, you didn't need the vaccine. But if you are a person with multiple medical problems, you were going to die, certainly from the initial strains of COVID. That's a medical fact. You had a high risk of death, well over 10 to 20%, depending on your comorbid conditions. And the vaccine eventually did a lot to mitigate that. That, on the other side of that, why we were keeping kids out of school is tough. We save people from heart failure. We've converted HIV into a chronic disease. Nobody dies from HIV anymore if they get medicines. And those medicines did not come from the government. They came from the brilliant minds of innovators and chemists working at pharmaceutical companies, working together with some academics, but pushing our chemistry and our understanding of medicines and coming up with medications that have not yet cured HIV, but have certainly made it into a chronic condition where most people with HIV can live a normal lifespan. The last bit is hepatitis C, which I'll close on, is a disease we didn't know the name of when I graduated medical school in 1992. We called it non-A, non-B hepatitis because we didn't know what it was. So we called it what it wasn't. But now we know it's called hepatitis C and it's cured. And this is a remarkable feat because this virus was thought to be incurable. And it is because of the pharmaceutical companies. We've done a lot in heart failure and a lot of other diseases. We still have a long way to go. And many cancers now are chronic diseases. All of that said, and all of the data and the facts that people are living longer with almost every single disease that we can name, people would choose to say this is all a conspiracy theory, that COVID came from, the pharma companies or the Jews or whomever. This is a way to get Pfizer to make more vaccines. I don't know where they got the Jewish thing because Pfizer took it from a German, licensed it from a German company and worked with them. Moderna is a U.S. company and so on, and multinational and U.S. company and so on. But it is ridiculous. I know I've gone on. I do want to mention one last thing because I've experienced it in my practice, and that is this. As part of this conspiracy theory, we all believe that there are natural products out there that you can go into a general nutrition store and get, talk to someone who has maybe a college education, and ask them what you should do for heart disease or arthritis. And these very well-informed people will give you a product off the shelf, which is derived from a root from somewhere. And this will cure you. And modern medicine is full of baloney, and we don't understand anything in modern medicine. And I had plenty of patients, and I still know plenty of people that consult with me in medicine who take a lot of this stuff, and there's simply no data for it. But it fits this whole notion of my own truth, and I have insight, it's all a big cover-up, and so on and so forth. And it's unfortunate that people still like mysticism. But I suppose that's why fiction sells so well.
Can I
Yeah, there
add
is
something?
there's a great episode of the Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David has to decide between what the pharmacist recommends and what the doctor recommends, and he goes with the pharmacist, if I
Of course.
remember correctly.
I was going to say it's a great addition to what I said to mention distrust in institutions because yeah, I think it is important to note that it's not all the fault of the purveyors of the conspiracist ideas. It's the one that I would cite, especially on top of the ones you mentioned, is the media, and I say this in spite of the fact that I'm on record and continue to, and I always get criticized when I say this, but I mean, I still think that professional journalists are better at figuring out what's going on in the world than bloggers and social media trolls. That said, they've had a lot of big blunders, and their ideological biases are usually the reason, usually get in the way of reporting the facts as quickly as they need to be. I mean, I think a good example of that right now, part of what's feeding all kinds of conspiracism about Biden is that, yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's been in cognitive decline for a while, and the media did their best to make him look better than he actually was. And then when that debate happened, it couldn't be spun anymore, and so they went, on the attack. But that's a case of not misinformation. It's a case of slanting that's ideologically driven, that has the effect of causing people to lose trust in them. And I think rightly so. I think you should trust them less than you used to. I still think they're better at figuring facts out about the world than a lot of other people. But you have to take them with a big grain of salt, and that then feeds the idea that you can't believe them on anything when they report basic facts. And the stuff that's been going around about Biden the last few days is very interesting. But yeah, so add to that. Definitely.
Yeah, and and of course the stuff that's going around the Trump assassination attempt is we need to talk about that. But first, let's get to Alexis's super chat. Thank you, Alexis. Alexis says, "Is it conspirationist to say that Russia has something to do with the dissemination of arbitrary falsehoods?"
Well, I think we know that the Russian government is engaged in, at the very least, disinformation campaigns, that they've employed, click farms to, and created bots that spread all kinds of crazy stuff. And I haven't studied it closely to find out how much of it is conspiracist, but I wouldn't be surprised if a good chunk of it is. If you want to create distrust and discord among Americans, and you're the Russians, this is a great way to do it. So, and we know that they're involved in some amount of that. How much, which ones, that's hard to know.
So with the Trump issue, I mean, and this is generally something that I think when I hear conspiracists is they're very religious-like, and of course in this case they're actually religious. I mean, Trump turned right at the right moment. That's God moving him or whatever. But yeah, I don't know how much I want to get into the different theories, but people are watching the videos and there's a woman in the back that doesn't react like the rest, so maybe she's in on it, and there's so much around it. And yeah, this is a big moment for conspiracy fantasists. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, shall I start?
Go ahead.
I mean, it is a remarkable concept that you would have a bullet pass next to your ear, having been fired from multiple hundreds of yards away, and you would take that chance that the wind wasn't blowing a little harder or a little softer, and that it was going to enter your brain and kill you. I mean, any bit of common sense, really, you have to think through this for about 30 seconds, and you realize any of these theories are absurd, right? You just wouldn't do that unless you were suicidal. And I think everyone would agree that Trump is, if anything, anti-suicidal. I mean, he's quite self-impressed and bombastic. So it's absurd. Stuff happens. I mean, you know, somebody turned, somebody didn't. There's all kinds of motion in any crowd. If you take a picture of a crowd when nothing's happening, you'll see all kinds of motion. But this is, I think, it's a general problem of people not trying to connect dots. I mean, they're not trying to think through stuff anymore. We listen to so-called experts on the news, and they're biased people who have an agenda, who want to make everyone else follow their sort of crazy agenda. You have people that are on YouTube selling whatever they sell to get people to look at them, so they say weird stuff that attracts people that don't think. It is, every human being has, it comes back to, you have to think about what you're being told, what you think, what you see. You combine it all and ask intelligent questions and then make a best guess. But when this notion that Trump engineered an assassination that took off his earlobe and didn't take out his temporal lobe of his brain is nuts.
And Michael, maybe you don't have the morbid fascination that I have with this subject to spend enough time on Twitter to see the whole array of different claims there are, because it's not just that Trump staged it to look good, it's also that Biden was behind it in order to kill Trump so that he would get elected, which turned out not to work either. But but it's especially interesting because there's so many. This is unique moment for conspiracism, because usually there's one event that looks bad for one side and they're the ones who have to gin up a conspiracy claim about it. This time it's both sides. It was shocking to both sides for one reason or another, and so each of them has one. And I think that's a testament to the fact that this is arbitrary, that it's a testament to the fact that it's a product of the imagination of both of them, because from the exact same situation, the same and complete poverty of evidence, they're able to come up with completely incompatible theories, which means that the details are being filled in by the imagination and not by any facts. And the fact that the New York Times did a study of this right within 2 days or so of its happening, and they found the first claim on X that Biden was behind it came out 4 minutes after the initial news went around the world. So, and then 30 minutes later, Laura Loomer, who's a loony conspiracist journalist herself, was spreading the idea to her 1 million followers. That's not a lot of time to engage in a forensic investigation. 4 minutes is exactly means there's exactly zero evidence that's been gathered, and that's what connects back to your question, Razi, about religion, because there's, I think, essentially a faith-based religious mindset that goes into conspiracism, and if you think about it, the same kind of quote-unquote thinking that goes into religion is evident in conspiracism. Religion is really just a big conspiracy theory. There's this big universe. We don't understand it. We don't know how it works. Strange things happen. We need to posit some kind of mysterious forces behind the scene which are also, personal agents that explain all of this. And whether it's nefarious purposes or benevolent purposes, I mean, that's a big conspiracy, the biggest conspiracy in the history of the universe, that there's a God who controls everything and makes sense of the things you don't understand, even though it doesn't actually help you understand them and doesn't actually explain them in any amount of detail. So it's no surprise that there's a correlation between religious attitudes and conspiracism. And I'm pretty sure there's actual social science that backs that up.
I'm looking at some stuff in the chat, Susie. We're not going to bring up Candace Owens. We're implementing on ARCUK a 48-hour warning policy about Candace Owens. Anybody who's on the show, if we're going to talk about Candace Owens, we'll give them a 48-hour notice to prepare mentally and physically. All right, let me ask this question that I thought of earlier, which is, to what extent does a person's inability to refuse or refusal to see a connection between abstract ideas and culture and politics make them more likely to buy into conspiracy theories because so-called theories because these people are rational enough to survive. They deal with the immediate concretes well enough that they're still around, still tweeting, and so on. But yeah, where do they fall off in the yeah.
Well, this goes back to one of the big factors I cited before, which is the failure to appreciate the role of ideas in history. But it's more than that. Let me give one example about COVID, actually. So COVID hits. It's a once in a century pandemic. Everybody's scared. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows, especially at first, nobody knows, how dangerous it is. Could it be, the end of the world, et cetera? So people are scared. People don't understand what's going on. And interestingly, what's the initial response of policymakers? Well, we know it's really harsh lockdowns all around the world. And in both red states and blue states in the United States. So it's the Democratic governors who, of course, did it the longest and the ones who get the blame for it. But Florida, Texas, all the red states did it too. And I think basically for the same reason, which is that when push comes to shove, the philosophical premises of everybody in our culture, left and right, are altruist and collectivist. And so there's a potentially civilization-ending problem. The solution has got to be collectivist. The solution has got to be that the government takes charge of everything and locks everybody down. And I mean, this is a really excellent example of a premise that is shared by everybody. It is all over the culture. You don't need to posit some wacky view that, it's just to test out this vaccine that they've wanted to give us for all this time or whatever. I mean, there's got to be easier ways to do that. No, that is the default operating procedure of our culture, is altruism and collectivism, and on the left and the right. And to add to the point I made before, because it's not simply that there's this idea that everybody accepts and that explains it better. It's also that many of the people who are coming up with the conspiracy claims accept the ideas themselves. And they don't want to blame those ideas because they accept them. I think of it, the controversy about the vaccine is a particularly telling example of this, because now, in fact, there weren't actually many government mandates in the West that you had to get the vaccine. There were some, not really in the United States. There were more in other countries. I think the closest we had in the U.S. was the military. Members of the military had to take it.
And many hospitals, just to add in.
And hospitals where it was a condition of employment. Yeah. So you didn't have to have the job. So it wasn't exactly a real mandate, but certainly something that people would object to, and so paternalistic in that way, at least. And so I think a lot of people who objected to those mandates, and I think rightly, like I'm on record, I wrote an article about why vaccine mandates are a bad thing. But a lot of people who are objecting to these mandates had a choice. It's like, am I going to challenge the right of the government to do something like this? Am I going to challenge the altruism and collectivism that's motivating these policies? Or am I going to challenge the science? And instead of saying, no, government doesn't have that right, I'm just going to say the science is made up, it's a hoax. And so many of them did the second. And they could have done the first. And Ayn Rand Institute did the first. We were very respectful of the science. And because what comes first for us is reason. What comes first for us is the truth. And a lot of them A lot of other people did the second. They said, no, let's just challenge science as such. And it's not the first time this kind of choice has been made. Like, I think, for example, that this is perhaps not with the same intensity, but I think it's sometimes the same dynamic with the way that people on the right deal with environmental issues, environmental claims. They would rather reject the science than just reject the altruism and collectivism and environmentalist ideas behind various environmental policies. And it's a dangerous thing because, like, I think it's true that climate science is not as sophisticated and advanced as, say, physics, but it's getting better, and we have a better understanding of what's going on in the world than we do. And the question is, what should we do about it? And nobody seems to want to challenge the idea that the government has the right to do these kinds of things, so they'd rather just throw out the science. But that's really dangerous because truth and reason are the fundamentals, at least in my philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, for my perspective, I'm in strong, heated agreement with you, Ben. The science behind the vaccine is clear. The other thing is just to differentiate it, say, from measles or something like that, where we have no treatments, B, it's a lot more lethal, and C, where we didn't ever gather that much data in the modern time because we had a ton of data on COVID. And I think personally, I was okay with a few months of lockdowns and trying to figure it out, but the science rapidly emerged and was finally taken, albeit late, by mostly red states, that we didn't have to lock people in and that didn't really matter. And if you want to get a vaccine, get it. And if you don't, you're going to take a risk, and it's your life to risk. And that's the way it goes. But you're allowed to live your life. And in fact, we know that the outcomes in Texas and in Florida were actually better than places like New York and New Jersey, where there were staunch lockdowns, because it just doesn't work. And by the way, medical science knows for a long time that you can't lock down respiratory viruses. We know that almost no matter what you do, even in a world when it was less populated and less restricted than we have today. You can't do it. It just doesn't work. Respiratory viruses are super communicable. And I'll just add to that, things like washing your hands and washing surfaces for a respiratory virus, this is complete idiocy. I mean, it's actually stupid. And for all those people who thought that this was a great idea, the amount of pollution we made, just so all the people that are on the left of all this and think everybody should have been vaccinated stood 20 meters apart and locked down the entire time. Remember how much pollution you caused with all this extra stuff wiping surfaces, which is not what communicates, which is not how COVID is communicated. Never mind the ridiculous and finally admitted to arbitrary 2-meter distance between people, which was based on Fauci waking up one morning and coming up with the number 2, because it's higher than 1 and was more practicable than 3. And he finally admitted at a congressional hearing, there's no science. And by the way, many doctors knew this. So I completely agree with you. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what business does government have in doing this? I personally think a few months of gathering data and understanding this virus, especially when it was alpha and pretty scary and pretty dangerous. But frankly, once it became omega, I'll say as a point, it basically became a vaccine for the world. And it was much better. But the conspiracy theorists are still going on. And now we have long COVID kinds of crap where it's been debunked in the science literature a year or two ago that long COVID is way more prevalent after actual COVID infection than it is after vaccine. Those are data that you cannot argue with. They are completely rock solid by multiple groups from multiple parts of the world. But people want to blame the vaccine. It's the same crap we have with vaccines and autism, where people want to claim that this whole vaccine thing in general is the pharmaceutical industry trying to make money. And so we give people, and measles vaccine causes autism. Well, A, it doesn't cause autism, and B, people who don't get measles vaccine get measles and either die from it or become paralyzed or extremely debilitated. And we find that when there's a measles outbreak, people are really sick and usually several die.
Actually, another example of how it's the failure to understand the way philosophic ideas move history is the general pattern of so many different conspiracy claims tending to blame the nefarious self-interest of companies. So the company wants to make money, and that's why they're trying to poison us with the vaccine. Leave aside the fact that if they poisoned us all, we wouldn't be around to be their
Exactly.
customers anymore. And so it's this philosophic suspicion about self-interest that they themselves share that leads them to posit these kinds of conspiracies, and they don't want to challenge that assumption.
Yeah, I remember the days of COVID lockdowns as really a time when I was ready to give up on humanity because, we here at the Ayn Rand Center UK, that's when we started doing daily shows, and we were uh, very, very strongly against lockdowns, and we were not in good company. I mean, we saw the other people who were arguing against lockdowns, and yeah, they had all conspiracy fantasies available were expressed. But since it is the last third of the show, I think we should talk a bit more about the Jews. And we should really thank Dan Bilzerian for this tweet. I don't think we can it even belongs in conspiracy fantasy. This is a conspiracy psychobabble. It's not coherently connected or tries to be, but it does blame the Jews for a lot of stuff, and that's been around since forever. But it's very prevalent nowadays with the war going on and a bunch of things around that. Any thoughts on that in general? Any thoughts on any specific conspiracy ideas around Israel? Okay.
I mean, I think that it's the fact that Israel, especially, is a target of so much modern conspiracism is another sign of the fact that this mentality is driven by not just tribalism, but the worst possible kind of tribalism, nihilistic, envy-ridden tribalism. That it's not driven by evidence; it's driven by imagination that is fed by hatred of the good for being good. In this case, that when for whatever reason you are insecure about your own abilities and status, you look at another person or party or country that is doing better than you are, that is more prosperous than you are, that's freer than you are, and you want to tear them down. And well, what better way is there to tear them down than to pretend that they're actually the bad guys, that they want to destroy everybody, and it can of course also motivate other people to help tear them down. And I'm pretty sure it's a historical fact that if you look at the Middle East in general, you don't start to get the kind of conspiracy discourse that exists now in the Arab world, whether about Israel or about the Jews or about the West. You don't really get it until the late 18th, early 19th century. And I think Bernard Lewis has written about this, that it's at this point that people in the Arab world are starting to come to self-consciousness about the fact that they are suffering from civilizational decline. That they once had an Islamic golden age. They were once the world capital of science and philosophy, but with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, it's becoming clear that Europe is on top, the East is in decline, and that this is when they start looking for somebody to blame other than themselves. And I think that's often the case. Not just in the Middle East with respect to Israel, but with lots of other conspiracy claims as well.
Yeah, I think it's like many of the things on the progressive end or the liberal end, this far liberal end, which has to do with envy. And for some reason, the Jews have been uniquely singled out as being a successful tribe or group of people. It's interesting that Asians or Indians who've prospered very well in America, in a lot of cases, don't typically get singled out that way.
Don't give them ideas.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we all know that after the Jews are gone, the Christians are next, but maybe they'll hit somebody else before they get to the Christian. I mean, the Arab nations that are violently militant say that they're going to annihilate the Jews, and then the Christians are next, and the goal is to make a worldwide caliphate. But I think it all comes, almost all of it, and things that move to collectivism come to envy. And the notion is that if you do better than I do, I deserve some of that, because surely in some way you repressed me or suppressed me or oppressed me to get to that point. And that's part of this whole dialogue now about the oppressors and this beautiful thing. One of the remarkable things to me is that envy is something that you can't build self-esteem, and I don't know how anyone is actually happy with being. No people that I know that are deeply envious of other people are actually happy people, and they've never accomplished anything on their own, or they haven't accomplished enough, and they always need something more. And if they can't do something more, as you said, Ben, they have to take somebody else's. And this does not lead to the pursuit of happiness. It never has, and it never will. This collectivist mindset is taking hold here, partly because of the teaching in America and the lack of philosophy, or a philosophy of success means bad. You say, the being against the good for being good, but I think it's even more potent hate. And I think that is, the notion is, if you're successful, it can only be by squashing other people, as opposed to it can be to make the pie bigger. And we all know that the pie is bigger. We see it also throughout. I mean, ironically, in Hollywood, which is considered largely Jewish, or overly Jewish, if you will, is some of the most anti-Semitic people in the world live in Hollywood, and love to get up on stage as actors and so on and talk about it. And then across the other side of this spectrum is this notion that we're going to get out of the climate crisis by suppressing people. That we're going to get out of, the planet will cool down if everybody just stops essentially living. We should stop eating anything we like. We should stop traveling anywhere. We should all essentially be on some kind of an economic lockdown, where we all know that the only answer to the climate thing is to actually move technology ahead and have our cake and eat it too. And even if the population were to stay the same size, which is not what the climate people want, they want it to decline, be clear. But even if it were to stay the same size, we are going to need to have better technology. Full stop. That's what we need. I'll bring it back to when we had the oil crisis in America, because Iran blocked, in the Middle East, blocked one of the passageways, and oil was shut down. So Jimmy Carter, in his perfectly beautiful, he was an early progressive way, he decided we were going to have to conserve oil rather than solve the problem. And we were going to somehow get out of the energy crisis while growing the population by driving 55 miles an hour, which increased transportation costs somewhere between 10 and 15%, which increased cost of goods by 10 and 15%. Of course, people took advantage, and so on. And it all rolled downhill. The only answer was to actually force people to make cars that had better gas mileage, to come up with alternative fuels, and so on and so forth. You solve it not by slowing down. You solve it by propelling ahead and coming up with great new things. Jews tend to do that kind of thing as a group, but so do a lot of non-Jews. And it's just going back to envy and how you see the world. The goal on the planet should be forward. Most people with individual rights, with their ability for the pursuit of happiness, and not to take anyone else's away.
Yeah, add to the point that you raised about the connection between envy and lack of self-esteem. There's an essay Ayn Rand wrote called "Selfishness Without a Self," and it's kind of a companion sequel to her previous article, "The Missing Link." The Missing Link is the one where she talks the most about the anti-conceptual mentality. The kind of person who doesn't want to develop first-handed abstract values for himself, who's kind of reactive to immediate perceptual data. And one of the things that she thinks is connected to that mentality is tribalism. Because you glom together with a group of people who look like you, who are going to give you your values for you. And Selfishness Without a Self, this companion essay, is also about the anti-conceptual mentality, but it's about a special variety of it. It's about the kind of tribalist who is so manipulative that he gets kicked out of all the other tribes, and he's constantly moving from tribe to try to gain some power over them. It's interesting to wonder about which examples of people she might have been thinking about when she wrote this. But there's this. It's in the mid-70s, so who knows? But there's this passage in the second third of the essay where she says the following about the so-called tribal lone wolf, who's this manipulative tribalist. Tribal lone wolf feels his self is dissociated from his actions, his work, his pursuits, his ideas. All these he feels are things that some outside power, society or reality or the material universe, has somehow forced on him. His real self, he feels, is some ineffable entity devoid of attributes. One thing is true, his self is ineffable, i.e. non-existent. A man's self is his mind, the faculty that perceives reality, forms judgments, chooses values. To a tribal lone wolf, reality is a meaningless term. His metaphysics consists in the chronic feeling that life somehow is a conspiracy of people and things against him, and he will walk over piles of corpses in order to assert himself? No, in order to hide or fill the nagging inner vacuum left by his aborted self. So that really gets to the depth of the foundations of the mentality. And I mean, she's incredibly incisive on this point.
Yeah, and that does tie into a point here that so WUB made a point in the chat earlier saying in the context of conspiracy ideas about Jews in the Arab world, the Arab world also suffers from an excess of Al Jazeera news and ding-dongs on TikTok. Look, Al Jazeera knows their audience. I mean, there's a reason they're successful. I mean, that would be my point there. I can't wait to launch our sister channel, Ayn Rand Center UK in Arabic, but we're not going to get those kinds of views because, our ideas are not going to be popular there at the moment. But yeah, I was talking to Ben earlier about some stuff I was seeing on Twitter after Israel struck back against the Houthis in Yemen, and there was so much wishful thinking and like people immediately saying, "Oh, look, they fired at Eilat, Tel Aviv. Everybody's evacuating in Tel Aviv. The airport is full of people trying to get out." And I saw people like George Galloway, who was a member of parliament in the UK until a few weeks ago, retweeting that stuff. So what's the connection between fake news and wishful thinking and conspiracy fantasies?
Well, fake news is just news that you've made up with your imagination. And that's all that conspiracism is. And now fake news is just putting it on paper, passing it off as though it's an actual report, usually to lend credence to the theory you're otherwise trying to spread. There's been a number of examples of this just with the Trump assassination conspiracy claims. So, for instance, when people started asking questions about why did they let the shooter get to the top of the roof and why didn't they take him out sooner, when people said, well, there's lots of good reasons why a Secret Service person wouldn't want to right away immediately shoot somebody in the audience. They could be held accountable for police brutality or whatever. Then they started saying, actually, there's a report from the very guy who eventually shot the shooter that he had him in his sights for minutes, but was given the order to hold off. And so that was the conspiracy masters, pulling his strings to make sure he would let them shoot Trump, even though he still didn't, because he still got the guy and Trump survived. And so there was a post somebody ginned up on 4chan where it's like, that I'm the guy who was the counter sniper and I'm the one who was told not to do it. Yeah, as though somebody in the Secret Service, the first place they would go to announce this, if they were to do it at all, would be 4chan and not the New York Times. So yeah, it's made to order bullshit that is there to, it's hard to believe somebody making it up thinks that it lends credibility to their own case. So sometimes it's just to sow discord, and sometimes it's both.
And I think there's a good push. People love to be first, no matter what it is, and it's something that we have to educate folks on, especially with the kind of immediate news analysis and things. It's a little bit reminiscent of the absurd Hamas hospital firing. The missiles that Israel killed 500 poor citizens at the hospital in Gaza. And we counted all 500 within minutes, and it was all due to Israel's fault with some of the most careful guidance. And of course, the goal was to be first out there with all this crap and just create discord, but also get attention. And people, I'm hopeful that over time, because this is kind of relatively new phenomenon, that people are going to grow up. I mean, one of the things you learn in any sort of in engineering and science, in most fields of any serious discourse, and certainly as you said earlier, we started the program with this thing about theories. The reason theory of gravitation is still a theory is because we haven't disproven it, but we haven't completely 100,000% proven it either. There's still a lot of experiments to do, but so far it has explained essentially everything it needs to explain. It has stood the test of time over and over again with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of experiments and data points. And people are going to need to understand that we don't have Walter Cronkite on the news anymore with thoughtful discourse and checking sources who actually will be named sources. What a concept. And checking to see if data triangulate. And that's something that hopefully will change. But people are going to have to think for themselves, and that's going to be a tall order.
Yeah, I when I find out that a young person is into one of these kinds of claims, and I've known several, I'm much more forgiving because they just don't know the way the world works. They don't know how many people are out there trying to deceive them, but they usually, the ones I've known, have grown up and have grown out of it. But unfortunately, there are many man children out there. That's the essence of what the tribal lone wolf type is. Some of them are influential in the media, some of them are in politics, and unfortunately, they're not going away. The most we can hope to do is to reach the younger people and to teach them, give them some tools to spot this kind of thing in the wild.
Well, we're going to continue to be here every day and try to help give people those tools. And I know the Ayn Rand Institute does that with Ayn Rand University, which there's a link in the description. You should check it out. Ben, do you want to tell people quickly about the courses you're teaching?
Sure, yes. I mean, we offer a whole variety of courses on Ayn Rand's philosophy, on thinking methodology, on communication, so aimed at instilling knowledge of the very tools I was just suggesting we need more of. So yeah, go to university.aynrand.org to learn more about it. I also mentioned that I have an article coming out soon on this very issue of conspiracism, especially as it came up in the various Trump assassination speculations. And so I'm not quite sure where it's going to be published yet, but look for it in the next week or so. I kind of dig into some of these examples and show how what's at work here is arbitrary use of the imagination. It's not actually thinking.
And tomorrow is the 1 year anniversary, of the reality show. Yeah, this show is going to be 1 year old tomorrow. Ben, this is your second time on the show. The first time was a couple months ago. Michael, you joined as a panelist earlier this year. So neither of you got to be in such episodes as in defense of Jonah Hill, or is X the new Coke? Both of those in the first week, by the way, of the show. Yeah, we have changed with events that made us realize that, even though I think the original idea for the show was nice, this is more important what we're doing now. So make sure you tune in to that. If you are an Inner Circle member, you can tune in to our production meeting, which will probably start a bit earlier than usual, and it's going to be a special production meeting for the 1 year anniversary of the reality show. Thanks. Thanks again, Ben. Thanks, Michael. Michael, once again, where can people find you?
Thanks. LinkedIn, Kaufman, 2Fs.
I'm Razi Ginsburg on X. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thanks, Razi.
Bye-bye.